From the mid-19th century and for about 70 years, the United Kingdom had a scheme to export children. 100,000 kids were sent abroad, essentially as indentured servants to the families who received them, and many of those kids came to Canada. Eleanor McGrath has made a documentary about these kids. It's called Forgotten. The filmmaker, Eleanor McGrath, and the executive producer of the film, Wendy Pitblado, join us now, and it's a delight to welcome you two here to our studio.
Thank you.
The reason I wanted you both in here was because I've never heard of this story before, and I suspect a lot of people haven't. So let's tell it. Why did the Brits send these kids abroad in the first place?
I would say, Steve, the best answer is that we were dealing with a post-industrial revolution era, and that was 1860s, 1870s. You had a migration from the rural settings into the urban settings. And people like Dr. Bernardo, James Paikin, Annie McPherson, Maria Ride, those are just the more common names, and ragged houses were picking these children up off the streets. They were living in dangerous situations.
These kids are orphans?
Or I would say, yes, many were, but often they were poor families that were unable to look after their children, and they were ending up on the streets. So it became a philanthropic way of having them move from these settings of danger into a safe zone. And off to Canada was a whole other conversation of colonialism.
Which we'll pick up on in a second. I think before we go any further, let's see a little clip from your documentary, Forgotten, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
Of course. I jumped at it. My idea of coming to Canada was going to be a cowboy. I was a cowboy, all right. Just milking them right away.
I got on the boat 6th of May, 1939.
It was a wonderful experience. Really a great adventure being on board ship. I mean, here we were, we'd been pretty much incarcerated in the orphanage for, I was there 6 years, I guess.
It took us 11 days to cross the Atlantic, and we landed in Wolf's Cove.
Wendy, those are two guys at the beginning of that clip who seemed to suggest that leaving the UK and coming to Canada was a fantastic thing, was it?
I think it might well have been for many of these children. The thing about it is, it's such an unknown story. These British home children. I studied Canadian history. I went to Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I had never heard of this ever. British home children. I went and saw Eleanor's film in March at the Toronto Irish Film Festival, and it woke something up in me, and I just had to learn more.
Why do you think this story has not been heretofore told?
I would say, in some ways, we have a great expression, the stiff upper lip. We associate that with the British sort of ancestry, and I really feel, sadly, and we've been seeing it now with Truth and Reconciliation, First Nations and Métis Inuit experience, these children didn't have any advocates, so that's one. Many of these children, further on in that film, you will hear them talk about how they were stigmatized. So they were called street Arabs, street rats, gutter rats. And I think that stayed with them. So even as they matured and they might have had families of their own, they didn't want to share that stigma with their children.
So they didn't want to tell the stories?
No.
So
the men you've just shown in that clip, where I interviewed them in their late 80s and 90s, they've only recently shared this maybe with their children 8 years ago.
So they have, Wendy, kept these stories to themselves for literally 7 decades.
That's correct.
When they arrived, were they welcomed as members of a new family?
Many were, and I think some were not. There are many wonderful stories that Eleanor has got on the film, and much tape that you've got that is not on film, that would suggest that many of them had some wonderful experiences and are still in touch. Their ancestors are still in touch with the farm people that they were with when they arrived here. But there are some very sad stories.
Well, let me pick up on a quote on that. J.S. Woodsworth was the leader of the CCF, which was the precursor to the New Democratic Party. And he's quoted as having said, "We are bringing children into Canada under their guise of philanthropy and turning them into cheap laborers." Is that what happened?
Yes, most definitely. I would say when you look back in history, and this is where our history textbooks need to be changed, both Wendy and I agree very strongly on that, we have a situation where there was an exchange of money That's not in my film. It was approximately $2 a head. So our government was paying Great Britain to bring these children. When the farmers then would indenture the children, and they were indentured, they signed a paper saying, we will be here serving you for 3-5 years. That farmer would pay $7 to the organization. So there became a monetary exchange. So what started with a very good place as possibly mostly Christian philanthropy grew very soon into a way of our government opening up the West. Opening up farm countries. In World War I, when we lost a lot of our young men, it was another way of bringing labor and cheap labor onto the farms to keep the home fronts going, the home fires going. When Mr. Woodsworth stood up and said that, I think it was actually late, because this operation had been going on since 1860s, 1870s. We had already encountered changes in the Juvenile Immigration Act because of deaths, because of murders, suicides of these young boys and young women. And there are both women and boys, girls and boys that were being brought over. So there's much protection that had to go on. And by 1929, they still hadn't done enough for these young children.
Were any of the kids abused?
Oh, very much so. That has been documented. And in fact, there is a part in the film of a young man that lost his life at the hands of the woman in the farm.
I mean, I did see the documentary, so I know what you're referring to, but we should sort of tell the story a little more for everybody else.
Yes, sorry. George Everett Green. So 1895, he was only 15 at the time. He arrives in Canada with they would bring over what they called a hiving off party. So they bring maybe 150 boys at a time, and he came from Bernardo's. They arrive into Canada, and he's placed on a farm with Miss Helen Findlay. She has him doing labor, and obviously is not caring for him. So by the time he dies, which is November of 1895, so it's March to November of this 1 year, the coroner's report states that he was emaciated, and as well gangrene. He had suffered terrible blows, that there was a lot of obviously damage to his poor young body. And that was really what started people thinking, we've got to start protecting these children. But it was not enough. If you go back to our country and how these boys would come into Toronto and then be shipped off to farms, maybe there's one person looking after Fegan's, for example, the distribution home. How is that one individual going to go and check on every child? And I think that's where the checks and balances fell through for these young boys and young girls.
Is there anything, to your knowledge, in any of the school systems of this province and or country that tells this story?
Not that we're aware of, and we are working very hard to try and get it into the curriculum. And have a chapter in our history books, and we've met with some people that are very excited to tell this story. And isn't that what history is all about? Telling the story of what happened in the past.
Because these kids are, they're not going to be with us much longer, are they?
That's
these
correct.
Former kids who are now,
That's
of
right.
course, in their 80s and 90s now.
Well, the gentleman in the clip that you just showed is 95. He's very well. He's delighted that he had this experience. He had a family. Everybody in his family knows that he was a British home child, but he's one of the happy stories, and he's one of the ones that will tell you his story because it is a happy story.
Those, however, who, let's say, were poor back in the UK and were sort of snatched off the street from their families, did they lose complete touch with the family back home?
Yes, and I think that part is the hard part, and maybe is where the intergenerational issues come out, because sadly some of the British home children that I've met or the descendants of have talked about how their fathers would not have the ability to love, or their fathers didn't have the ability to show anything beyond alcoholism and left the family. And why is that? I think they've been uprooted from their own family of origin. If it was poor, that does not mean that it's a bad family. As we know, today we are more cognizant that intact family is so much more important. When they came to Canada, many lost touch. So even if they came with 2 or other siblings, they would be sent to different farms and so remote, and they'd lose touch again. Many of the people I've talked to as descendants have just discovered they have family in England or family in Ireland, and I think that's heart-wrenching too, because they know their father was always yearning for something. It explains their father's behavior, but it doesn't really help now that he's gone or she's gone. And I also feel a very important person in the film that I interviewed, Colette Bradford. She had been with Bernardo's for many years. And
Bernardo's is that home back
home.
in
It was the largest, really. It's still operating. They do good work. But at the time, she says, in the late sort of 80s and early 90s, all of a sudden these calls were coming from Canada asking for records and they were discovering they had family, but they were now in their 70s and 80s and couldn't travel back home. So how do you answer for that? And that's where the governments have now tried to do some sort of restitution.
Well, let's pick up on that. I guess there's two schools of thought on this, right? That these people are owed an apology of some kind, or not. And if so, by whom? What do you think?
That is a very, very thorny point. I would agree with you. There are two schools of thought. There are some that had a great experience, and they say no apology is necessary. And then there are many who say, we think that the British Home Children movement was not a very positive thing in our experience, and we would like a government to make an apology.
Which
and
government?
Perhaps would that be the Canadian government? They're the ones who were paying for the $2 a head for the boys to come over. So I think it's the Canadian government that they're looking for an apology from.
Well, I think because Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister, made that initial apology, and our government at the time viewed it that it wasn't an important issue. It was not on the radar of many Canadians. And I think, sadly, we've started to see, and I don't know if both you would agree, that if an apology happens, we pay attention. You know, as a population, we look at it and we say, oh, we should know more about this situation. I just would like to draw another parallel to what happened with our First Nations children in the residential schools, because I think that made us all aware. And once you have awareness, you no longer can claim ignorance.
Sure, but there's sort of unambiguous evidence that the Canadian government was responsible. There was a policy, and therefore something to apologize for. What exactly is the Canadian government supposed to be apologizing for in this case?
I would say just by virtue of having actually mandated and institutionalized and paid for these children coming over, that is one area that a lot of the people who are on the side of having an apology feel that's strong enough.
Are you on that side?
I actually would like to stay as a director of the film.
You want to stay neutral on that?
Not so much neutral. I think as a mother, I believe it would be something of recognition. Maybe if the term recognition was used, I think our government in some ways, beyond 2010, which was the year that our Canadian government declared as the British Home Child Year, we have a wonderful man in our provincial legislature here in Ontario, Jim Brunel, who declared September 28th as the annual year of the British Home Child. I think that's beautiful and important. So maybe a recognition of some sort, permanent recognition, because these kids helped build our nation.
They did, and the interesting thing is, well, this is all counterfactual, but the reality is, had they stayed in Great Britain and not come here, undoubtedly many of them would have been killed in the two world wars that took place over there on that soil, as opposed to, maybe their life wasn't great in Canada, but at least they were alive. That's fair to say, isn't it?
I think it's fair to say, and I would suggest to you that there are boys that were here that found out about family at home and realized that they were doing better than the family that they connected with back in Britain. So, backing up to your point about an apology, I'm not sure that an apology is necessary. I will say that. And I do think a recognition would be a wonderful thing, and I think if we had, if we learned more about it, if this was part of our history and we didn't pretend it never happened. As I say, I'd never heard of it. British Home Children, didn't know anything about it.
I'm not sure we're pretending it never happened, because to pretend it never happened means you know it happened and then you just want to sweep it under the carpet.
Yes.
Nobody knows about this period.
No one
That's
knows.
right.
No?
So maybe if I can just interject
Sure.
around how this story unfolded for me as a person was in 2011. I just happened to walk down a street in Toronto, George Street, and it's a very marginalized street today, but it was formerly a very wealthy neighborhood. And I saw a building that 295 George Street, Georgian architecture. I knew it was significant. I phoned the city and I said, why is this not being preserved, after I discovered it was not?
Well, what's the significance of that address, 295 George Street?
295 George Street, I only then discovered, after saying it's significant as a Georgian architecture, was that it was the Paikin home for the distribution of boys. And Steve, I have to tell you, that word distribution, I associate with Walmart. I did not...
Not children.
Not children, no.
We got a shot of this. You
Okay.
want to, Sheldon, let's bring this picture up here, because this is, I just took a snap, actually,
Oh,
of,
good.
this is a
Okay.
screen capture from your movie.
Yes.
And people may recognize the man in the middle of that shot. That's the former mayor of Toronto, David Miller.
Right.
And what's happening at this get-together here? That's at 295 George.
That is, and it was in July of 2013, and you will see David Miller, who I have fortunately been he's been a champion. And why? Because he felt that as an immigrant himself from England.
Yeah, he's born there.
He's born there.
That's right.
This story resonated with him, and then the individuals that you see around him are the descendants of the British home children, specifically to the Paikins. And that was a smaller organization. They brought 3,000 boys, and they were just boys. And those boys went only to Ontario. They were 50 sort of miles out was the radius. There's a special part, though, of that wall, and I'm so proud that you showed that picture.
You want to hold that up?
I would
Okay,
love
hold
to
that up.
hold
Which
this
camera
up.
should we get this on, Sheldon?
When I walked down, and then subsequently for about 2 years started doing filming and pursued this, it was something I did out of passion and as well as commitment once I discovered these children, and I thought, I have to help these children. Their story needs to be told. And this wall was the back of the actual building. And I had actually filmed people like Councillor Wong Tam, and she had talked about how she wanted this preserved. I never knew about that signature. So that's a brick.
What do you think that is?
Well, it says H. Cody. Each of these boys, the owner at the time, Frank Mancini, said, have you seen the names? I said, what are you talking about? What names? He said, the names on the back of the wall.
So these kids scratched their names into the bricks on the back of the
300
building.
names more. And these names are possibly sometimes the only place that you can touch that child for his time here. And I'm so proud to see you have our poster of Forgotten. And the young boy that's in that poster is Jack Foot. And Jack Foot actually served at Vimy and didn't come back. And how did I even learn about Jack Foot was because there's a brick with J Foot on that wall. So I just feel there's a reason I walked by that house. I don't know why. Serendipity, God incident. And then on top of it, it's to meet people who are equally supportive and want to see the story of children being told and shared broader.
How many children do you think from Great Britain ended up over here in Canada? Anybody got a good guess on that?
I had heard 100,000 when I was doing the film.
100,000.
So I put that film to bed in 2015.
And how many would still be alive today of that 100,000?
I'd hate to say even just thousands. And because that started as that movement, 70 years worth of movement. The only thing I would say, though, the number seems to grow. People are doing great research at our National Archives. There's a wonderful group of individuals up there that research every Wednesday. So if you find all of a sudden your family tree only goes back maybe one generation, possibly you are connected to the child migration of the British home children. On top of that, I think we are seeing numbers because of the passenger lists are being identified. Even names on brick walls might start leading to new names coming up as British home children. We could grow up to 125,000, maybe 130,000.
The historical record is kind of everywhere in plain sight if you know how to find it.
How to find it.
Well, let's finish up on this. Wendy, you know, there's a lot of important history that we need to know to better understand our country and ourselves. So you're in competition with a lot out there right now. Why is this story, do you think, important for people to know?
I think it's very important because we need to honor and remember these children. It's what we owe them. And I feel very strongly that they helped build Canada. And we have a wonderful nation, and they have been a big part of the development on the farms, as Eleanor has mentioned, you know, through the world wars, at a time when we needed farm laborers, and we had them here. And it's a story that needs to be told. So I hope it becomes part of our curriculum in some form.
I think an historic plaque at 295 George wouldn't be a bad idea either, if
hope
you don't
so.
mind my suggesting.
No.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
So the other really fun thing about this is they were all young boys, 12, 13. All the names are up to a certain height on the wall.
Of course.
You must go and see because,
Yes.
you know,
You couldn't reach higher.
They couldn't reach any higher.
Interesting.
It's a very moving thing when you go and experience the names on the wall.
Great. I mean, if people want to see your documentary, how do they do that?
Right now, it is actually on Amazon.ca. They can purchase it, and we have a very exciting upcoming screening that is going to take place at Hot Docs in April. So
April 2017.
2017, April 12th. So very much, I think, tied into Canada's 150. We're honored to be included, and the President, Chris MacDonald, is going to be the moderator of a panel afterwards.
Great.
So thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share this story.
We are delighted to have you come in and tell us a story that I'm quite sure so many people don't know anything about. That's Eleanor McGrath, yes, spelled McGrath, but pronounced McGrath, and Wendy Pitblado, the filmmaker and the executive producer of Forgotten.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.